More fallacies. Chapter 7, we're looking at errors in argumentation, fallacies, things that you need to avoid. And the authors are picking these fallacies because they're actually used often in discussions. And so we need to become more aware of these forms of argumentation and try to avoid them, certainly in our own work. And one of the main fallacies that we're carrying through this chapter in analyzing different forms of it is the ad hominem fallacy. And that's when, instead of focusing on a critique of the argument, you focus on the person. Ad hominem means to the man. To the man. And so here, instead of analyzing or criticizing the argument, we're criticizing the person that offers the argument. This is a fallacy. Now, there are many kinds ad hominem fallacy. We talked last time about the inconsistency ad hominem. And that's where you argue against the argument offered by a person because that argument, the conclusion, is inconsistent with a position that that person has taken other times in his or her life. So this position is inconsistent with a position that person has taken before. Now, this is a fallacy because the argument that you're offering now should be considered on its merits. And the fact that you might have been wrong in your past does not mean that you are wrong now. The fact that you were wrong in your past should not be held against the argument that you're offering now. For example, Rush Limbaugh uses this example of George W. Bush. So this is the inconsistency ad hominem, and it's a fallacy. Just because something you're arguing now is inconsistent with something that you have argued in your past doesn't mean that it's wrong. And this one's a pretty good one. When a smoker rejects the claim that he should quit smoking because it is made by another smoker, that doesn't make it wrong. You should quit smoking, man. He could be right, even though it's inconsistent with his own behavior. So we shouldn't allow that inconsistency to undermine our analysis of the logic of an argument. A lot of people, have you heard this argument before? Inconsistent. Oh, it must be wrong. That's against what Obama said 2 years ago. So you'll find that this kind of argument is often used. Circumstantial ad hominem. This is rejecting a claim because the circumstances of the person making the claim. For example, you might reject what Father Hennessy says about abortion because he's a priest. Just because he's a priest, you're going to reject everything he says on that issue. And there are a number of cases here. Let's say you have this position on the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And as soon as we hear that he's from where? BP. Oh, it must be wrong. So we use that fact that you work for this, or you're a priest, or you're a cop. We're going to use that fact, that circumstantial fact, to conclude that your argument is wrong. That is a fallacy. That is a fallacy. Once again, we should be able to analyze the argument that Father Hennessy offers independent of his profession, independent of the fact that he's a priest. Circumstantial ad hominem. Everybody see that? Yes, ma'am?
It's usually difficult because when you are already something that, like, I'm saying it's difficult because if a priest is talking, you already know what he's supposed to think, so it's just normal that you think that way is circumcision. It's difficult to think the other way when a priest says something because you already know he's a priest, this is what he's supposed to.
You know where he's coming from.
Yes.
Absolutely. He's informed by the Bible. He's going to follow out these teachings. So you certainly know where he's going. However, we can't use that fact to simply conclude on that basis alone that his argument is wrong. He could come from that background and offer a good argument. That's the idea here. Maybe the probability is that it might not, but there's still that chance. Still that chance. So we shouldn't use the fact that somebody comes from a certain profession or somebody has a certain background to reject an argument that they offer. That would be an example of circumstantial ad hominem. Now, another form of ad hominem is what we call poisoning the well. This is certainly used quite often. Here, what we do is we try to lead you to reject a claim by poisoning your view of the person making the claim. And so we're going to try to, I remember a while ago, and maybe it still happens now, a lot of people always wanted to say President Obama's middle name and emphasize it. What's his middle name?
Hussein.
Barack Hussein Obama feels that we should do this on international policy. Many argue that it's a version of poisoning the well. You are trying to make the president look un-American by focusing on his middle name. Yeah, it's kind of childish. It is kind of childish. But that's where the maturity of our country is right now, many would argue. Seriously, that would be a view as a way to poison the well. Liberals do it too. Absolutely, Caleb.
I think that diminutive use of the first name by
Barack
JP is also part of that.
Calling him Barack or something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the past, like before Bill Clinton, there was always like Mr. President, but then there was Bill, now it's Barack.
Yeah, there could be a little bit of that
It's
going
a
on.
shortcut around the respect. President Obama is
Moreover, that whole birther movement could be a version of poisoning the well. Is he really from America? I don't know for sure. I think, in fact, they asked Rick Perry whether the President Obama was born in the country, and he did not say definitive. He was kind of dancing around it. Well, if you are suggesting that the president's not from this country, you could see that as poisoning the well, and therefore, leading people to question what the president advocates. Is he really American? Does he want good for our country? Well, you're kind of raising the question. Yes, ma'am. Good.
Yeah, Hussein too is like a Muslim name, so I think they are trying to say he's Muslim too.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now let's think of on both sides of the political fence. There's all kinds of poisoning the well. For example, Vice President Cheney worked for Halliburton, and many people concluded that because of that relationship, when Vice President Cheney is advocating on behalf of the Iraq War or other of our hostilities, that he's really doing the bidding of this company. And people who make a big deal about that relationship he had before he was vice president, that could be a version of poisoning the well as well. Oh, he's really an employee of Halliburton, that's what he's doing. Well, no, actually, he left that company and he's the vice president of the United States. So by bringing that up, you could see that as a version of poisoning the well. I like this. Mrs. Jones is not an axe murderer. Well, why are you putting axe murderer in that sentence? And here, the idea is that you just get the term Miss Jones and axe murderer in the same proximity, and you get people worried. Let's say that Miss Jones is applying to be your babysitter. This is what you read in the resume. Miss Jones is not an axe murderer. Contrary to, this creates questions. So there are surreptitious ways in which you can poison the well. Barack Hussein Obama, various. Now, we talked last time about the genetic fallacy essentially being the home of the ad hominem fallacy. And the ad hominem fallacy was considered to be simply one form of genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is when we reject a claim because of its origin or its history. And what we now use the genetic fallacy to refer to cases where a person is not the target, because when the person is the target, it's considered an ad hominem fallacy of one of the various forms. But when it's not a person, when we're instead referring to a club, a political party, or an industrial group, then it's called a genetic fallacy. So my man here, Austin, let's say he's offering this thesis about the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. If I hear that he has worked for BP for the last 10 years, and I reject his claim on that basis, we would consider my rejection to be a form of the genetic fallacy, because I'm rejecting his argument based on the fact that he works for BP, not because of something he is as a person, but because he associates with this industrial group. So that would be a form of genetic fallacy. Yeah.
I think the same could be said for Darwin. People accuse him of being racist because of the times that he lived in. But he was the first one to posit that there's like only one human race.
Yeah, if you reject Darwin's evolutionary theory because of some racism you find in his discourse, given the fact that he lives in a time where there was racism, that shows really the problem with the ad hominem argument. My goodness, you'd end up rejecting just about every good idea that came forward, because everybody's guilty of something. Most definitely. Greer?
I was going to ask, if you're rejecting his argument because he worked for BP, wouldn't that also still be poisoning the well? Or no?
A version of it, yeah.
So if
absolutely.
that was like a quiz question, you could go with either one, or?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. These kind of bleed over because they're all in the ad hominem territory, to be honest with you. Absolutely. Yeah, that would be poisoning always from BP. Been there for 10 years, employee of the month frequently. All kind of building up, we're going to reject what he has to say. So if we're rejecting an argument just because somebody belongs to the Democratic Party or the NRA, that would be an example of the genetic fallacy. Now, we left off last time talking about the positive ad hominem fallacy. This is the opposing version of the ad hominem. And that is when you accept an argument or claim because of some characteristic of the person making the claim. Maybe there are some who have drank the Kool-Aid and accept claims simply because it's offered by President Obama. Well, that would not be a reason to accept an argument as true. And if you are doing it on that basis, then you're committing the positive ad hominem fallacy. Rather than rejecting a claim as a result of some aspect of the person, you're accepting a claim because of some characteristic of the person. Positive ad hominem fallacy. Questions? Comments? All right. Now, the first new fallacy for the day is what we call the straw man fallacy. You will definitely find this in discussions of various issues in different disciplines, certainly in philosophy. Straw man fallacy is a very popular form of argumentation. This is when someone attempts to refute a claim by distorting it. By distorting it. So you take this position that this guy has outlined, and then you distort it in a way that makes it look really weak. And then you reject that weakened version of the claim, and you say, oh, I've won. I win. I win. And then this guy's going to come along and say, you know what you just rejected has nothing to do with my book. You completely generated this false position, and then you cut it down and you think you've accomplished something. So the idea is that you create this false position, a straw man, and you argue against that rather than the real position, called a straw man argument. For example, George Will says in one essay, George Will is a famous conservative pundit, fairly intellectual, a philosopher. Democrats' opposition to personal retirement accounts is really rooted in a reluctance to enable people to become less dependent on government. Now, this is not what Democrats say. And George Will does not have a unique line into the consciousness of Democrats. So he has, generally no idea what he's talking about here. How does he know that people, feel this way on the other side of the political divide? So what he's doing is he's projecting, this idea that Democrats really want this and creating this distorted position and then rejecting that when he's not really looking at the arguments that are offered by Democrats. This would be a version of the straw man argument, where you distort a position and then you reject that distorted position and you think you've accomplished something. The straw man fallacy. Questions, comments? All right, next one. False dilemma. False dilemma is when alternatives are unjustifiably limited. Austin, when did you stop beating your girlfriend? He's delaying with the answer. That must mean you're guilty. I'm joking. That presents a false dilemma. How did I present Austin a false dilemma? Yes, ma'am?
Oh, I have a question.
All right.
I don't have the answer for that. But that example you just said, when did you stop beating your wife or your girlfriend? Isn't that the same as a loaded question?
Yes.
So it's the same thing?
Yes. Now, how is it a false dilemma?
He's not really beating his wife.
What's that?
He's not really beating his wife, but it makes you think that he is.
Correct. And in my question, I say, when did you stop? So I'm assuming that he's already beating his wife, and the only choices I give him are when he stops. Well, all the choices I provide are not acceptable. So I am creating a false dilemma. It's either 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, or 3. No. One of the options has to be he's not beating his wife or his girlfriend. And so I haven't allowed for a true alternative to be presented. Yes, ma'am?
All right. What's the difference between that and poisoning the well?
False dilemma. There will be other ways to poison the well. This is not saying anything about the person. And poisoning the well is saying things about the person that lead you to question the argument. So a false dilemma is when we provide alternatives which are unacceptable, and those are the only ones that we provide. For example, many have argued now, particularly on the Republican side, either we cut expenditures, cut what our government is spending, or our country will go broke. That was kind of the argument during the debt ceiling debate. I don't know if you remember. Now, how is this a false dilemma for those political science majors out there?
It's like all or nothing.
Well, and it
That's
overlooks the fact that we can raise taxes on rich people. And that'll generate more revenue. And, there are other alternatives besides either cutting expenditures or going broke. There's a whole bunch of other ones in there that aren't considered. So this dilemma as it's posed would be false in the minds of many. Either you endorse prayer in public school or you are an atheist. How's that a false dilemma? Can you be against prayer in public school and not be an atheist?
Yeah.
That's one of the alternatives that is overlooked here. Maybe you are a Christian who believes in the separation of church and state. So, a false dilemma is going to present false alternatives and limit the choice to those. There are real dilemmas in life. Believe you me. I've only got so much money. I've only got so many bills. The dilemma is which one to pick. Well, these are real dilemmas, and they should be taken seriously. but there have been cases where people pose false dilemmas, and we need to be wary of those. Questions, comments?
So is a real dilemma then not a fallacy?
What's that?
Is a real dilemma not a fallacy then?
Correct. Correct. So if I have only X amount of dollars and I need to pay my mortgage, I don't have enough, I have to choose what I pay, and it's a real dilemma. There's nothing false about it. Nothing false about it. Are any of you perfectionists? By the way, I think I'm anal retentive in a certain way. If you have a notebook like this and you pull the paper out, I have to rip these things off. It is a disgusting thing I have to do. I got 50 papers to grade, but I have to take those things off first. Perfectionist fallacy. Maybe I belong in a rubber room. I don't know. But there are some of us who expect things to be perfect. Perfect. Life is not that way. Yes, sir.
Paul McCartney was one of
You really? Paul McCartney was a perfectionist. Interesting. And he worked well with Lennon, who wasn't a perfectionist.
yeah. I mean, he was the one who would just rush, and he would just
Lennon would rush.
Yeah.
McCartney would want to get it right. Well, I heard that they had this wonderful relationship. McCartney's the perfectionist and also kind of happy. Lennon was down, and McCartney's writing the song, "You have to admit it's getting better." And then Lennon kicks in, "It couldn't get much worse." They really worked well together. But I meant it could be tough working with a perfectionist recording an album. Those first albums they recorded pretty quick, though. Not a big problem. So the perfectionist fallacy is when we reject something merely because it is not perfect. For example, the NFL should not use replay because you will never be able to make every call correctly. First of all, that's true. We'll never be able to make every call correctly, even if you use replay. They make mistakes on replay. It's unbelievable. However, should that alone be a reason to not use replay? You can get more calls correct. And if you're only going to use things that are perfect, maybe you use nothing, because in real life nothing's perfect. So this should not be a reason to reject the use of replay just because you don't get every call perfect. Just because something is not perfect is no reason to reject it. We should not have police because they will never be able to prevent every crime. No argument there. No argument there whatsoever. Now this is an interesting one. The line drawing fallacy. This line drawing fallacy is when we insist that a clear line needs to be drawn when that is not the case. And you can really see this through an example. Does anybody remember the Rodney King case where he was beaten by police? Tragic situation. And supposedly they have a lot of this on film. And they look at the film, and some argue that the first blows given to Rodney King were not excessive. But as the tape progresses, it appears that things do get excessive. However, many argue that as the tape goes on, there's no clear line where what they were doing becomes acceptable and then it becomes excessive. There's no clear line that we can draw, and therefore many conclude that there's nothing excessive in the whole thing. And so the fallacy here is the idea, the assumption, that there needs to be a clear line between guilty behavior and not guilty behavior. And the the suggestion is, by this fallacy, is that there doesn't need to be a clear line. Sometimes things can evolve, and pretty soon they just evolve in a way that changes completely to a different category. And you don't need a line to prove it. It's a version of the false dilemma. A version of the false dilemma, the line drawing fallacy. Questions, comments? I can imagine how you could use this with war. How initially the war seemed to make sense, but then 8 years into the Vietnam War, people wondered, what the heck are we doing? Line drawing fallacy. Now here's a popular fallacy called the slippery slope. The slippery slope fallacy. This is assuming that one thing leads to another when that is not necessarily the case. For example, if we allow government to regulate the use of guns, it will eventually be against the law to own them. This is an argument that is believed by many real people in the country today, and it has actually impacted the sale of guns and the sale of ammunition. When President Obama was first elected, did the sale of guns go up or down?
Up.
And the sale of ammunition went up, up, up. And why? Because people literally thought that he was going to take their guns away. So they were trying to buy more of them to stock up. And Obama is certainly going to regulate, he's going to make the price of ammunition go up. And so there was actually a run on these guns and the ammunition. They are trying to stock up. Yes, sir?
I read an article the other day saying how a lot of this opposition to gun control comes out of a fear that people won't be able to feed themselves because they need guns to hunt the food. It was interesting, and embarrassment of not willing to admit that has led people to take this posturing.
A lot of hunters out there.
Yeah, oh yeah. But I think this relates also to the containment idea, Truman doctrine, domino effect, the one communist country
Very good point.
will lead to another one.
Very good point. This was the argument offered by many in support of the Vietnam War, that if we allow the North Vietnamese to turn Vietnam into a communist country, it won't stop there. The whole eastern area will become communist, and before you know it, we'll be dealing with a larger communist threat. And so I think they called it the domino effect. If we allow one country to go communist, all these others will go. So we need to fight it now in Vietnam before it gets closer to our border. And many would argue that that's an example of the slippery slope fallacy. In fact, the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, what was his name? Anybody remember? He now has had a chance, and he's passed away. No, it was the guy he used to work with Ford. I don't remember. But he had a chance to go talk with the Vietnamese decades after the Vietnam War. And they pointed out to him that this conflict had a lot to do with their own history and the role of the French people and all this other stuff that the United States was not considering. And so by viewing it simply in terms of that domino effect context, we overlook the true history of the Vietnamese people and how that history contributed to a unique phenomena in that country. We're kind of seeing it all through the lens of communism and really misunderstanding it as a result.
To them, it was a colonial.
Exactly.
Ho Chi Minh was there. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln.
Exactly.
So he kicked the French out, and then resisted the Japanese, and then these new the French come back after World War II. And they have to destroy them at Dien Bien Phu, and then this new colonial power comes in, America, to ostensibly to help the French.
So this, viewing it from the perspective of the domino effect, was really a simplistic way of viewing the situation, and didn't help us at all.
You take out circumstance and you act as if there's one like cosmic law to all war. But
Problematic.
I think in this case the communism was tied to liberation theology.
Liberation theology?
I mean just fighting against colonial
Yes.
oppression.
Absolutely.
Similar to some of the leftist movements in South America.
Well, here the problem is when we simplistically view something as leading to something else necessarily, when that's not necessarily the case. And in terms of the Vietnam War, the idea is that if Vietnam goes communist, then the whole Asian area will go communist and really contribute to a domino effect. That's not necessarily true, and by viewing it that way, we overlook all these aspects of Vietnamese history that contribute to that situation. So the slippery slope fallacy is when you unjustifiably assume that one thing is necessarily going to have to lead to another thing. Questions, comments? I even mentioned Vietnam. All right. Misplacing the burden of proof. This is an interesting fallacy, and one that you really need to take note of, and one that is certainly relevant to discussions of political issues on cable news in our culture. Misplacing the burden of proof is essentially captured in that title, and that's where you assume that somebody else has to prove their position rather than you having to prove your own. Let's take an example. In 2003, many were trying to prove that we did not need to go to war in Iraq. Now, this is an example of misplacing the burden of proof. Why? Yes, sir.
Because it's like, so if a lot of people are trying to prove why we shouldn't have gone to war, that isn't it like, they're like, well, why? So if someone says, like, ask you a question like, why did you do this? And you're like, well, why not? Isn't that it?
In a way, where should the burden of proof be placed on an issue like this?
People who are trying to prove that we shouldn't have gone to war.
Don't we think that the people arguing that we should go to war should have the burden of proof?
Yeah.
You know? And here, what's happening is that, you know, President Bush and his team decided a couple days after 9/11, we're going into Iraq. That's what's going to happen. And so
They decided that before 9/11.
That-
they had a file.
is what's happened. And so they are persuading everybody, and hey, you don't want to wait till the mushroom cloud, right? And so the momentum towards war is already developed. And consequently, in the press, the question isn't why should we go to war? The question comes to be, why should we not go to war? And people are beginning to make arguments for why we should not go to war, because nobody's expecting people to argue that we should. It's almost assumed. And you got these scare tactics used all over the place. So the authors of our text argue that this is a very important example of misplacing the burden of proof. And many, for example, argue that our press, the press in the United States and around the world, quite frankly, completely and totally fumbled the ball here. Rather than, you know, considering arguments against going to war, they should have been asking questions about the arguments for going to war. Where are they? You know? And why aren't we putting more critical heat on that side of the argument? Yes?
Just, I think we were discussing in my political science class is that
Cultural science?
political science,
Political science.
is politics of the third world, and I think the argument was that maybe the bigger issue was what the U.S. would do after 9/11 was just far more important than just questioning why we would go to war with Iraq. You know what I'm trying to say? Is that the fact that the U.S. was attacked was that the reaction was in itself so I mean, it was so natural that people had a hard time questioning where to go and what to do.
We wanted to attack somebody.
They just knew they had to do something, you know.
Yes.
And Iraq was the perfect gateway. And I guess people before questioning in itself why we go to Iraq, the thought of like America being attacked and terrorism was just bigger than the war on terror. I think that's a problem.
I think you're absolutely right. You knocked down the Twin Towers, and we're going to do something about it. The danger is that we appear to be like that drunk at the bar who got cold cocked by somebody, you know? And this guy did it. He's laughing, this smart ass. And so now, you know, we kick his butt. But now we're at the bar and we're going, anybody else got something to say about it? And then we're starting stuff with everybody at the bar. And now people at the bar would like us to leave. In fact, when we do, we give a Nobel Prize to the other guy who walks in, Barack Obama. And so there's kind of this idea that you're exactly right. That after we got cold cocked by this guy, we're ready to start a fight with anybody. Which is very, very dangerous. And you remember that axis of evil that included Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, I think? And we already bombed one of those. How do you feel if you're in that axis? You know, we're like starting stuff with other folks at that point. And you're absolutely right. The fact that we were attacked, it seems to implicitly justify that reaction, which really kind of makes it even more dangerous. So because we were attacked, your point is well taken, that might lead us understandably to accept the reasoning that we should go to war in Iraq. And if you're going to question it, you begin to offer arguments that we shouldn't go in, rather expecting people to offer arguments that we should go in. Hey, we were attacked. That's why we're going. Very good point. So misplacing the burden of proof is when you are assuming that somebody else has to take that burden of proof when perhaps you need to take it yourself. The burden of proof should have been on the other side. Should have been on arguing that we should go into Iraq, not those arguments that argue that we should not. Where does the burden belong? Now here is something that you need to understand in order to avoid this fallacy. Those claims that are initially plausible are not going to need the burden of proof. Those claims that are initially not plausible, they're going to have the burden of proof. Claims with the least plausibility, in other words. Those who are affirming something, arguments that affirm something, have it. Like we should use this tax policy, 999. If you're affirming that we should change our tax policy to 999, well, Mr. Kane, the burden of proof is on you to prove that 999 will help us. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, is that kind of relating to like common law where the prosecutor has the burden of, proving?
Yes. We're innocent until proven guilty. Very good. The burden of proof is on proving that somebody is guilty. And if they can't prove that you are guilty, you are set free, even if you're guilty. Very good point. Thanks, Greg. What's that?
Casey Anthony.
Casey?
Yeah.
Casey Anthony, who killed her.
I haven't been keeping up. I'm sorry.
The American girl in Italy just got released.
No.
The girl that killed her baby.
No, that's
That's allegedly.
the other one.
Well,
Allegedly killed her.
yeah, but she didn't report it for a month.
Well,
when it was out
I said
partying.
allegedly.
Killed her baby.
Killed the baby.
That's what he just said.
So, the idea is that the burden of proof is on proving her guilty. And if we can't prove her guilty, we have to...
Set her free.
Unless your name is Troy Davis.
Troy Davis?
Yeah.
Who's he?
Is that the guy from Atlanta
Who got...
who got the death penalty even though like no one?
Yeah, except if you're African American. We can make you... We've done that before. That was sarcastic, by the way, with the video. Just making that clear. So here, the suggestion is that if you're affirming something, then the burden of proof is on you. So Herman Cain, if you want your 999 plan to be accepted, you're going to have to accept the burden of proof to prove that it'll work. Yes, Caitlin?
I guess ID, or intelligent design, is no.
If you are suggesting we ought to change our thinking to intelligent design, then the burden of proof is on you?
Right, or to like teach people like equations in the classroom.
I can tell you in the scientific community, yes, the burden of proof would be on you. Absolutely. Absolutely. I like this. If you go to the movie theater and you want to get in, do you have to be a certain age to get into our movies now?
17.
17. So, if you go there and you say, and let's say you get a discount for being a student. Well, if you assume that the burden of proof is on them to prove that you're not a student, that's not going to be acceptable. You're affirming that you're a student, so you're going to have to show a student ID to get that cut rate on the price. Because the student is the one affirming that he is a student. That would be great if you could go to a bar and, hey, you have to prove that I'm not 21. That wouldn't work, would it? No, it would not. And in special circumstances, courts, contracts, they're going to specify where the burden of proof should be. And as Greer pointed out, in most common law cases, the burden of proof is going to be on those that are proving that somebody is guilty. It's assumed that you are innocent until the burden is proven on the other side. Thanks for your help there, Greer. Good point. Dangerous and costly claims have a higher burden of proof. So if Herman Cain wants to change our whole tax system to 999, well, that's actually a dangerous and costly thing to change. Our country could go further into debt if we do this thing. So since the policy itself can have such an impact on our society, we could argue that the burden of proof needs to be particularly high. Now, if Kaylin's determining whether to wear that stupid sweater he wore last week, the burden of proof on that, who cares? Really not going to impact life as we know it. So we're going to allow Kaylin to make that call with a low burden of proof. But if we're trying to determine whether to go forward with a different tax policy, well, then we're going to get the people with PhDs to look it over very carefully. Any questions with misplacing the burden of proof? Interesting idea. And the idea is that as we prove things, the burden of proof is going to have to be placed in certain areas. And using these guidelines, we can place the burden of proof in the right area if we follow them. All right, moving on to begging the question. I think Maria mentioned that early on, maybe, begging the question.
No, I mentioned loaded questions.
Loaded questions. Loaded questions. Well, begging the question is when you try to win the argument early on the cheap by kind of setting the argument up so that you can only win. Haven't heard that before. When the conclusion of an argument is also a premise of the same argument. So in a way, you're getting the conclusion that you want to argue for into the premise itself so that it has to be supported in the conclusion. It's a form of circular reasoning. For example, consider this one. I wonder if you could get some Jehovah's Witnesses at your door that would offer you this. God must exist because the scriptures say God does exist. And they, the scriptures, were inspired by God and must be true. What is circular about that argument? Yes, sir.
They're pretty much saying that God says he exists.
Yes, exactly. And so God is used to prove that God exists. Now, if God doesn't exist, then you can't use that premise. So, absolutely right. You have, in a way, got part of the conclusion into the premise itself, and therefore the premise is going to support that conclusion. It's a form of circular reasoning, or begging the question. If we expect the audience to accept the premise that is not at least as controversial as the conclusion, this will be another form of begging the question. The authors will tell us that an argument needs to begin from a place of agreement. And this is why we don't use rhetorical definitions. We don't define our terms in a divisive way that some people would not accept. The idea is that when you construct an argument, you construct it on grounds upon which we all agree. The terms used in your premise are grounds upon which we all agree. And then the argument itself is going to take people from that premise to that conclusion. Now, if people see in your premise that you are begging the question, or that you're loading the argument with rhetorical definitions, people will not follow you to the conclusion. And you'll lose that audience that would be persuaded by your argument. So rather than beginning with rhetorical definitions or beginning in a way that begs the question, you want to begin your argument in a way that all people accept. And then when you construct that reasoning, they'll all be led to the conclusion. We don't want to beg the question. That's incorporating the conclusion into the premise itself so that the argument has to establish the conclusion. Questions? Comments? Well, that's it for the day. I will see you guys on Thursday. Have yourself a good one.